What's up, guys? What's happening? Gino Ganello coming back at you here last week, as I mentioned, starting this new show. And here it is, the first episode. We're going to call it right now. We're going to call it as it's a working title, The Technical Area. It's something that I had, workshopped before for something else that never ended up panning out. So I think for now, we're just going to stick with that and run with it. And if we come up with a better name down the road, we'll switch it up. But for now, we're going to call this The Technical Area. And this is the very, very first first episode of that. Happy to, have all you guys joining me. And, it's going to be a lot of fun. And we had a great first weekend of Premier League soccer to start things off. And it was, a lot of action. VAR very involved in a lot of different ways. A lot of surprises, a lot of disappointments, a lot of exciting performances. And I think without further ado, we should get right to all of that and recap it real quick with the very first segment, the very first edition of this segment here on the technical area. It's called Around the Premier League in 180 Seconds. So let's get this thing going. Let's start the clocks here and let's get rolling with a recap of what happened over the past weekend. All right, starting off, opening weekend, Friday night, the Prem started things off with the defending Champions League winners and a newly promoted side facing off, and the first half looked exactly like that. Norwich looked like they left their defense back in the championship, while Liverpool fired 4 goals past Tim Krul. The Canaries put together a much better second half, but not good enough. Liverpool wins this one at Anfield 4-1. Moving on to Saturday, the defending Premier League champs opened their season up at West Ham. The first half was a bit shaky, but City still found themselves up 1-0, and then came the storm. West Ham fell apart, and despite VAR rearing its head for the first time ever in Premier League history, even that couldn't stop City from dominating the second half as they won this one 5-0. The wind was blowing in South London where Everton took on Crystal Palace. Despite interest from the Toffees during the window, Wilf Zaha started on the bench for the Eagles, and it showed. The first half was dominated by Everton, but without a goal, it left the door open. Zaha came on in the second half, and Morgan Schneiderlin got a red card, turning the tides in Palace's favor, but nothing would come of it as this one ended in a scoreless draw. Rough start for both Southampton and Burnley in their first match of the season. In the end, the Clarets woke up, the Saints did not, and Burnley took this one easily 3-0. From one game that finished 3-0 to another, Watford and Brighton faced off at Vicarage Road to start the year. Abdullah Decore slotted an own goal midway through the first half, and that would be a sign of things to come. Watford couldn't get back on their feet. Brighton took advantage and shocked the Hornets on opening day. From London to Bournemouth, Sheffield United traveled to Vitality Stadium to take on the Cherries in their first test since being promoted. This one was all about defense, and by defense I mean defenders playing offense. Chris Mepham and Billy Sharp both put one in the back of the net, Sharp in the 88th for Sheffield United as each team snagged a point apiece to start the season. Nope, that's not Wembley. Tottenham were actually able to start their new season off at their own stadium this year, but that didn't help much in the first half. Newly promoted Villa came out firing, scoring 9 minutes in, and it would stay that way until Christian Eriksen, who started on the bench, came on and literally changed everything. New signing Tanguy and Ndombele scored. Harry Kane scored 2 goals in a game in August, and Spurs took it 3-1. Moving to Sunday, Leicester City took on Wolves where VAR was the star. The Foxes dominated, but Wolves would have won it if it weren't for the new review system. Instead, this one finishes scoreless. The other early game on Sunday had Newcastle facing off against Arsenal. While it looked like the Gunners struggled, they also had some of their best players on the bench. 62% of the possession in a 58th minute Aubameyang goal led them to 3 points on opening day for just the second time in 5 years. And finally, we get our final match of the weekend. The game that was supposed to be the best game of the week, well, that would have been if Chelsea actually showed up. Kurt Zouma gave away a penalty in the first half, and the Chelsea defense fell apart in the second as Manchester United spoiled Frank Lampard's managerial debut to the tune of a 4-0 victory. All right, that's your recap of what happened last week and last weekend. Just a quick around the Premier League, something you'll be getting every single week. Hope you guys like that. And again, we'll try and do nice, quick, short recaps like that one as the as the weeks go by. So just getting into a little bit extra recap now as we look at some of the games over the past weekend that we just talked about. I got a couple other segments that we're going to introduce here. Obviously new here. These titles are also working titles. I'm not sure if I'm going to keep them, but this is how we're going to have it now because I think it best explains what I'm trying to talk about in a soccer manner. And you'll understand that right now as I explain it a little bit. So let's get into the first segment, which is called Champions League Bound. And these are not teams that are, bound for the Champions League, the top 4 teams in the league. It's not a power rankings of any sort. It's more like teams that I felt overperformed or performed really well over the course of the weekend. So if you had a very good weekend, you're going to be on this list. If you overperformed against a team that you shouldn't have beat or a team you shouldn't have played well against, you'll be on this list week in, week out. Obviously, in England, 4 teams make the Champions League, so we will have 4 teams that I felt had the best weekends in this list on a week-to-week basis. So let's get right into it. And the first team is Burnley. Burnley took on Southampton this weekend. We talked a little bit about it, not too much about it, really because it was a domination by Burnley. They started off rough, came into the second half on fire. And granted, Southampton, I don't believe they're going to be a very good team over the course of this year, but still an impressive 3-0 victory for Burnley. I think it's something that they can build upon. Obviously, a team that I don't really see as scoring a ton of goals this season. And they got off to a great start, and that's always good to start your season off with a 3-0 win, no matter who it's against, getting those 3 points and getting your season off on a good foot. So I think Burnley probably had one of the best weekends overall out of any of the teams that played this weekend. Moving on now to Man City. That's the next team here in Champions League bound. And again, this isn't just teams that overperformed. These are teams that played really well. And Manchester City is one of those teams. They're one of the teams that played exceptional this weekend. Tough first half. Struggled through the first half with West Ham. West Ham was putting some pressure on, but still found themselves up 1-0 at the half. And in the end, it was absolute domination. 5-0, even with VAR disallowing a goal. Just a great job by Manchester City this weekend in taking a decent team. I don't think West Ham's that bad, and making them look pretty awful in the second half there. So obviously, Man City, one of the best teams in the world, and just another deserving performance here in this in this past weekend, and deserving of the Champions League bound recognition this week. Next is Liverpool, and I hope this is proving that I'm not going to be biased on this show, and you'll see a little bit more of that as the show goes on. But I mean, if you're a neutral fan in this, really, no matter what kind of fan you are, you have to look at this Liverpool performance and just kind of say, wow. The first game of the season, obviously playing a Norwich team who was not very good, but came out firing. 4 goals in the first half. Norwich just didn't look like they were up to the same level as Liverpool. The second half, they got it together, but I think that was more of a factor of Liverpool kind of sitting back and not really worried about scoring goals because they had this one locked up in the first half. Sorry about that. 4 goals in the first half, and really just dominated this game. Didn't really need anything in the second half. So a great performance by Liverpool there. And then finally, one that may come as more of a surprise to you guys out there, Sheffield United. Now, Sheffield United has been newly promoted this year, and they had a great game. Bournemouth is not an easy place to go and play. The Vitality Stadium is really a safe haven for Bournemouth. That's where they get a lot of their wins, a lot of their points. And Sheffield United went in there, went down in the 62nd minute and fought back, got a goal in the 88th, and managed to come out of there with a point. And for a team that's newly promoted to have that resilience, to play well at a place that's not easy to play at, and get a point there, I'd say that's a pretty solid performance by Sheffield United. Now moving on to a segment that's similar to the Champions League bound, but different in the sense that instead of looking at the best teams, we're going to look at some of the worst teams from the past weekend. And to prove that I'm not biased again, here's the first team under what we'll call relegation worthy, because We're going to have three teams here, three of the worst teams this weekend, teams that underperformed or just did not have good games. And the first team is Everton. I think Everton played pretty poorly over the course of this weekend, or over the course of their game this weekend. Did not have a good match against Crystal Palace, a Crystal Palace team that they probably should have beaten, especially with how things shaked out. Wilfred Zaha not starting the game, dominating much of the first half, but the second half was absolutely horrible from an Everton perspective. Wilfred Zaha came on, they dominated a lot of the game. Everton's Morgan Schneiderlin got a red card. Just not a good showing from Everton there. A 0-0 draw, not what they would have wanted, no matter who they put out there, even if they didn't put a lot of their signings out there to start the game. Just not the type of result they would have wanted from this one, especially against the Crystal Palace team that I think is going to probably be in a relegation battle at some point or another during the course of this season. The next team is Chelsea, and I think Chelsea just had an awful weekend, and probably the worst weekend out of anyone here that we're going to talk about. I think Chelsea was, obviously they have a lot of things to work on. Frank Lampard, the new manager, a lot of young talent coming in. One of the youngest teams that is in the Premier League, if not the youngest, but still really no excuse for the way they played on Sunday. They were completely out of it. The midfield was absolutely horrible. The defense wasn't much better. Not really getting much from an attacking perspective, although it was better in the first half than it was the second half. But it just overall wasn't great by any stretch of the imagination. And a Manchester United team who I don't think is as good as Chelsea made them look. And again, I don't think Chelsea is as bad as Chelsea looked, but I think that Chelsea had a really bad day. The defense had gaping holes in it for people to run through, specifically on that Paul Pogba ball where Marcus Rashford ran through, a ginormous hole, in the middle of the center back and Cesar Especialeta. It was not a good day for Chelsea. It wasn't a good day for their defense specifically, and definitely worthy of the relegation worthy tag that we're giving them here today. And then finally, Watford. Watford, they had a shocking performance because they didn't really play anybody good either, and they played probably as bad as Everton did, but they lost by a lot. They lost 3-0 to a Brighton team who is definitely not 3 goals better than this Watford team. And obviously Watford were missing a few of their typical starters and some of their new signings, but still no excuse for them to fall 3-0 no matter what, especially at home. They put together a terrible performance. Doucouré with an own goal to start it off, and they couldn't get back on their feet from there. Just a bad performance by Watford, and that's why they're the third team here in this relegation-worthy section. Moving on to the final review of the week, the game of the week. Tottenham versus Aston Villa was my personal game of the week, and here's why. I know it wasn't close. I know there wasn't, a crazy, goal in stoppage time, and it ended up that the score be 3-1, but I think this was probably one of the most exciting games of the weekend. Aston Villa coming out firing, scoring a goal 9 minutes in, and really taking charge and taking it to this Tottenham team and making them look, silly out there as, they couldn't figure out what to do. A lot of the possession was controlled by Aston Villa. They really dominated parts of the game, especially in the first half, and really couldn't figure anything out until Tottenham brought on Christian Eriksen. What seems to be the key to all their success. Christian Eriksen comes on, he's successful, and he changed everything in this game. And Ndombele gets the goal in, I believe, the 73rd minute. And then, of course, the excitement of Harry Kane grabbing 2 in the final 5 minutes of regulation. It just really had it all, this one. I think it had the excitement of a newly promoted side going to a big team in Tottenham who has a lot of promise. Tottenham didn't play many of their new signings, but it was an unbelievable game. One that I think was probably the best this weekend. Not a lot really to choose from. Not a lot of close, exciting games this weekend. And I think by far this is probably this was the best one out of all the games that happened over the past week. All right, so that's it for our review section, and now it's time to move kind of into the quick preview of what we're looking at here. Um, for the rest of, or for excuse me, not for the rest of the season. Moving into next week, into week 2. So let's take a look at some of the games that we're gonna have to that we're gonna see this weekend. Obviously, week 2. So we're gonna do our best predicting them here, but can't guarantee anything because we don't really know how good teams look. But we'll do our best. So starting things off, Arsenal Burnley, the early game on Saturday. This one will take place at the Emirates, and just to rattle off a few stats before I tell you what I predict in this one. Last time Burnley drew Arsenal was 2009 in the Premier League. Last win versus Arsenal was 2008 in the League Cup. And the last win versus Arsenal in the top division dates back all the way to 1974. Arsenal have also won the last 10. So we're going to go with an Arsenal win in this one. And similarly, the next game, the Liverpool versus Southampton game, as we get into the 10 a.m. Eastern time games, the 3 p.m. games over in England, Liverpool, Southampton. There's really not much to say about this. Southampton's bad. Liverpool's really good. Liverpool's going to take this one easily. Now moving on to another interesting matchup. One of the first interesting matchups that we have here moving into the second week. Brighton versus West Ham. Obviously, Brighton coming off the big win. West Ham coming off the big loss. And just something to look at here. Since returning to the English top division, Brighton has yet to lose to West Ham. They've been up for 2 years. They have 3 wins and 1 draw. And I don't, on the other hand, I don't believe that West Ham is as bad as they were on Saturday. So I think these teams will even each other, even everything out. I think that, Brighton comes down from that 3-0 win. West Ham comes up from that 5-0 loss. And I think this one ends in a draw. Now moving to Watford versus Everton. This one will take place at Everton, at Goodison Park for their home opener. And I think here's a couple things that I think that apply to both these teams. They're going to be adding new players to their lineups and to the fold for the first time or for more time than they did the previous game. Obviously, from an Everton's perspective, JPG, Jean-Philippe Gbamin, and Moise Kean played minutes in their game against Crystal Palace, but did not start, and it is believed that they weren't fully fit, and they'll have much more time with the team. So that's something to look forward to for both of those teams. And another thing is both these teams are not as bad as they played last week. They're both in the relegation-worthy section, but they're not that bad. They're much better than they played this past week, and especially a Watford team who went down 3-0 to the Brighton team that we just talked about. Now, all time, Everton is 19-4-5 against Watford. But since Watford rejoined the Premier League in 2015, they're just 2-3-3 against them, but have never lost to Watford at Goodison Park. So, if you even all that out and really look at everything and looking at these two teams, I think it's going to be a draw. It's always an exciting match between these two, as 5 of the last 8 games that they've played against each other have ended with a goal scored in the 75th minute or later. So it's going to be a really interesting one, and I think that one wraps up with a draw. Next one we got on the slate is Norwich City versus Newcastle. And now, this one's going to take place at Norwich, and Norwich City's wins, all of them against Newcastle since the start of the Premier League era back in 1992, have come at Norwich. So that's a big positive for Norwich City coming in this one. But it doesn't look much better from there. Newcastle's only lost once to Norwich since 2011. Newcastle put in a good performance against Arsenal last game, and I think they'll probably do the same in this one. And they're not Liverpool, but they're still pretty decent. I'm not sure about Norwich's defense, and that's why in this one, I got to choose Newcastle winning it marginally, but winning it at Norwich. Now to the final final game of that 10 a.m., 3 p.m. slot. We got Aston Villa versus Bournemouth. And I think this is one of the more interesting matchups on the slate. These two teams have only faced each other 7 times total. Aston Villa leads the series 4-1-2. But I think the two biggest things here, is that Aston Villa will be at home in their return to the Premier League. Their first game at home. The crowd is going to be rocking. The players are going to be excited. And the other thing, as I mentioned before, Bournemouth play really well at home. Bournemouth play really bad on the road. In their last 2 years, they are 10, 7, and 25 on the road in the Premier League. Aston Villa, the excitement behind them. Bournemouth on the road, probably not as good as they typically are at home. I got to give Aston Villa the edge in this one, as I think they take home 3 points in their return to the Premier, in their return to their home stadium in the Premier League. Now looking at the final game on Saturday, the 12:30 p.m. Eastern time slot, the 5:30 p.m. In England slot, Manchester City versus Tottenham. And when is this game not exciting? I mean, you got to love this game. This is two of the best teams going at it. This one will take place at the Etihad. You know, Tottenham have only beaten City at the Etihad twice since 2010, and in their last 7 meetings, Tottenham's only won once, and that was last year's home match in the Champions League against Man City. This one, I think, is determined a lot by who Tottenham plays. Eriksen was clearly so big in their match last week, and I think if he plays again, he could be a significant factor that could get them a draw or maybe even a win. It at least gives that possibility. I think without him or even Lo Celso playing, I think it's going to be pretty difficult. I think City win, and I think it's really what the starters for Tottenham decide is by how much. I think that City can probably win by 2 goals if Eriksen is not starting or Lo Celso's not starting. I think City probably would still win, but marginally, maybe by 1 goal, if Eriksen and or Lo Celso are playing. So that's that for the Saturday games. Let's take a look at the 2 Sunday games that we have going on. And here's Crystal Palace versus Sheffield United. This is the early game. This one is a little bit unpredictable because the last time these two teams played was back in 2011 in the Championship. Obviously, Crystal Palace coming up not a while ago. Sheffield United hasn't been up in a while. This is their first season back. I think Wilfried Zaha is the difference, as is every game for Crystal Palace. If he plays, they win. If he doesn't play, I think that Sheffield United can get a draw or maybe even a win in this one. Because again, I don't think Crystal Palace is that good. And I think that Sheffield United at home can take advantage of something like that. Or excuse me, they're on the road. But still, I think they can take advantage of the fact of Wilfried Zaha not playing, no matter where they play this weekend. The next one is Chelsea versus Leicester City. This one's going to be the late game on Sunday, and this is Lampard's home debut as a Chelsea manager. But a couple things on this matchup, which is interesting, which I think this is probably, other than Manchester City-Tottenham, I think this is probably going to be the second best match of the week. I think that, last season Chelsea didn't beat Leicester at all. Other than that, Leicester's 7-3-2 overall against Chelsea since their return to the Premier League. I just think Chelsea need to work some things out. I'm not sure that, they'll have everything figured out. Leicester's a really solid team, and they showed it against Wolves, who was another really solid team this past weekend. I think Leicester comes out, puts in a good performance. I think Chelsea gets better, but not good enough. And I think that this one ends in a draw. And then finally, we've got Wolves versus Man United. This is the Monday game, and this one is another great one. A lot of good games on the slate, really, for this coming weekend. But this one's another good one. You got Wolves. They came up last year and beat United in the Premier League and the FA Cup once each, and then also drew the other time that they played them in the Premier League. So have yet to lose to Man United, and I think that that is a really big stat for Wolves. I think they'll come in with confidence. Obviously, they'll come in with confidence having come off the draw last week. And if it wasn't for VAR, which I think made the right call in this one, Wolves would have won their first match against a good Leicester team. I think United's defense is much better at first glance. So I think that when you look back at the games against Wolves last year, obviously you kind of have to take them with a grain of salt. But I think it's going to be a really interesting matchup. I'm not convinced United is as good as they were against Chelsea. I think Wolves is a really solid team, and I think this one also ends in a draw. So that's it. That's the preview for this coming weekend. That's our entire show, the technical area. Hope you guys enjoyed everything that you heard here. Hope it gave you some good information, and I hope you guys can go on and at least be a little bit more involved in your conversations at work whenever, or with your friends whenever the Premier League comes up. But for now, I'm Gino Ganello. That's it for this week. We'll talk to you guys next week. Peace.